In this webinar, we will review the Food Safety Modernization Act Final Rule for Preventive Controls for Animal Food and the key requirements necessary to reach compliance under the rule. We will also discuss the current good manufacturing practices for animal food production, analysis of hazards and preventive controls for covered facilities, supply chain programs, farm definitions, and the feed mill exemption for vertically integrated operations. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Attendees will learn about produce safety, foodborne pathogens, worker health, wildlife, land use, post-harvest handling, and legal issues associated with food safety in Indian country. The IFAI has also launched a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will result in the award of a food safety certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We're merely trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today and other resources referenced in today's presentation. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety, where you will find links to these resources, more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. The issues we will cover in business practices, microbiology, and legal issues are additional information our experts believe is important to have access to as a grower. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Dr. H.L. Goodwin, will take questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can submit a question by using the questions feature of the control panel. We will also be conducting a live poll before the presentation. We encourage everyone to participate in this poll because it will allow all of the attendees on today's webinar to see the diversity represented among our growers. If you have your mobile device handy, please pick it up now and I'll walk you through joining our live polling activity. Your participation is anonymous and none of your personal information will be accessed or shared. So, if you have a mobile device and you'd like to participate in our poll, there's two ways that you can participate. You can either log on to a website and cast your votes or your poll responses through the website, or you can do it by text. And I'll take you through each one of those options. If you would like to participate by text, open up your messaging app, and the number that you will text to is the number you see on your screen here, 37607. And the first thing you'll do is you'll send a message, and the message will be HL Goodwin 156, the one that you see on your screen. And when you send that, it will send you back a response letting you know that you've been admitted into the poll. Once you receive that response, you will text in your responses to the questions, and your responses will be recorded. If you'd like to use the website, you'll go to the web address that you see on your screen, pollev.com/HLGoodwin156, and it will take you to a website that will pull up the polling information, and then you can answer the polling questions using the website. So we will go ahead and get started. Here is our first question. Somebody's already responded. So you'll see that you can select, the question is, which term best describes you? And you can select A, B, C, D, E, F, or G based on which you think best describes you. So for those of you that are logged in, go ahead and submit your answers now, and we'll see those populate on the screen. And I'll give you a minute to respond. All right. We'll move to our next question. And that is, in what region do you live? And these are the BIA regions. So just find the BIA region that you live in or that your growing operation is in, and submit your response. All right, we'll move on to our next question. If you are a grower, what is your primary crop? And the choices are root vegetables, small fruit, grains, tree fruit, leafy vegetables, or other. All right, and we've got one more question. If you are a grower, what is your average annual gross sales? All right. So we'll go ahead and get into today's presentation. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. H.L. Goodwin, the Senior Economist and Food Safety Director at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Dr. Goodwin is a professor and poultry economist at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, a Senior Economist and Food Safety Director at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and the Director of Student Networking and Curriculum Enhancement for Buppers College. He joined the faculty of the University of Arkansas's Center of Excellence for Poultry Science in Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness in December 1997. Prior to joining the university, he was the Agricultural and Food Systems Policy Advisor to the Minister of Agriculture in Slovakia and a Fulbright Scholar in Czechoslovakia. He was faculty at Texas A&M's Department of Agricultural Economics and served as the Associate Director of the Texas Agriculture Market Research Center. He received his PhD in Agricultural Economics from Oklahoma State University in 1982. HL, the presentation is yours, and I am handing you the mouse.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate everyone's patience. We were delayed about 10 minutes at the beginning. It was an unavoidable delay, but I appreciate your staying with us. And I appreciate your participation in the live poll that we did. This subject is overwhelming, really, to try to present in a webinar. There is a complete 2-day training course to go through to learn, 2.5 days actually, to learn the preventative controls for animal food. But what I'm trying to do is give you an overview to let you know whether or not you may be, in fact, impacted by this and how to respond if you are. There will be follow-up as we go through next year on some specific points, particularly current good manufacturing practices. But for now, we're going to go ahead with today's webinar. So what are the key requirements? First off, you need to know that this is active as a part of FSMA as of September of 2017 for larger animal food facilities. They must comply with preventive controls ever since September the 18th. So if you're a large animal food facility, you are already under the preventative controls for animal food piece of FSMA. And so what exactly does that mean? Uh-oh, I hit too many spaces. I jumped a long way here. What happened there? Need to go to my second slide. Okay.
This is
here we go.
Yeah, here's the
okay,
second one.
Thank you, Brian.
Uh-huh.
The compliance dates for preventative controls for animal food are staggered, similar to the manner in which they're staggered for preventive controls for human food and the produce safety rule. We'll look at that in a minute, but the next major compliance date comes in September 2018 when small businesses have to meet preventive controls. And we'll look at what the definitions of those 3 classifications of businesses are when we get a couple of slides into this. The rule requires animal food facilities must have a food safety plan in place. And this has to include a hazard analysis to determine which hazards need control and a risk-based preventive control to minimize or prevent the hazards. I realize this sounds a little bit like gibberish, but as we get into this a little bit, it'll clear up, I think. So let's look at business sizes. And you'll notice the 2 columns here, a current good manufacturing practice compliance and preventive controls compliance. The larger firms, which is anything over 500 or more employees, they had to be in compliance, as we said earlier, by September the 18th. But notice, current good manufacturing practices compliance date was September 19th of 2016, so a year earlier. What does this mean? It means that on the same date that the larger firms had to be preventive control compliant, the small businesses, those with fewer than 500 full-time employees, had to be current good manufacturing practice compliant. So that you can see the 1 year stagger. So for the very small businesses, those that average less than 2.5 million, adjusted for inflation per year for a 3-year period, those have to be CGMP compliant by September 2018 and preventive control compliant by September 2019. Notice on the bottom, note, records to support your status as very small businesses had to be in place or must be in place since the beginning of 2017. So if you're planning on supporting your status as a very small business, you have to have records that show that you are in fact a very small business beginning in 2017. Why is that? Because otherwise you could be a larger business or a small business, but not a very small business. And if you don't have records to show that you're very small, you actually are in violation of the FSMA regulations. So it's very, very important to keep these sales records to support whatever status that you're claiming you have. While I'm on this, this 500 full-time equivalent employees, that doesn't mean 500 people working in a feed mill. That means 500 people working for the business that owns the feed mill. So for example, if you're part of a tribe that has all of their agricultural enterprises intermingled under their tribal umbrella, you could have a feed mill that employed 6 people that would in fact be a larger business because in all likelihood you have more than 500 full-time equivalent employees. So it's the business organization, and we'll see that as we go through some of the qualifications and the guidelines on where that really would come into play. So there are 5 key requirements. Here are the first 3. Covered facilities must follow CGMPs for animal food production. We're going to go through that, what those are. Covered facilities must establish and implement a food safety system that includes, we've already said this, but we've got it delineated here, an analysis of hazards and, if necessary, risk-based preventive controls. Number 3, and this is interesting, and this will be talked about in some detail in about 15 minutes into the webinar. Some animal food facilities need a supply chain program to address hazards in raw materials and other ingredients. If you are someone who inputs raw materials into, let's say, a feed for swine or poultry or pets that has some animal origin of raw materials, there's a supply chain program that you may indeed have to follow, and we'll get to that in a little bit. This is very, very important. The 4th point, the definition of a farm describes 2 types of farm operations. First, and we'll get to those, but the point is, operations meeting this definition are not subject to preventive controls for the animal food rule. So if you are indeed your business qualifies as a farm, and you are indeed a farm, you don't have to meet these qualifications for preventive controls. Point 5, feed mills that are part of farms, vertically integrated operations, are not covered by the preventive controls for animal food rule. Why? Because you're controlling all the product. So, and we'll get to that as we go through the seminar. And number 6, and this is I say it's a requirement, it's really an information point. Compliance dates and assistance to the industry will be provided by the FDA. So let's look at what current good manufacturing practices are. FDA has got a whole list of these things finalized. And when this webinar is posted, it will become live. You see the handout. There's two handouts in the handout section on the bar on the right side of your screen. Good manufacturing practices, et cetera, et cetera. It's a PDF document. It will be available for you after this is posted. And it will go through in great detail what current good manufacturing practices are. But what they endeavored to do was to consider all the unique aspects of the animal food industry and provide some flexibility, because it is complicated and there are a lot of nuances to it. So FDA's finalized that, and we've posted the resource there. Processors that implement human food safety requirements and who are holding byproducts for use as animal food don't need to implement additional preventive controls. Why? Because they already have preventive controls in their human food plan. So if they're doing wet spent grains, potato peelings, orange peels, rotten fruit, liquid whey, whatever it is, they do not need to have a separate animal food preventive control plan, except to prevent contamination. So you need to have a plan to prevent contamination, but it does not need to have all the specifics of the preventive control for animal food. What are some examples of contamination? This seems obvious, but just to state some: trash, cleaning chemicals into the container holding byproducts, etc. So if you keep the byproducts uncontaminated, you don't have to have a separate preventive control rule. And I noticed something that came across yesterday that I would have never thought about, but there was a recall of something like, it was over 10 tons of chicken salad because it was suspected of containing pieces of plastic. So that's an instance. You think about plastic or some other physical contaminant or a chemical contaminant. It's not just biological from pathogens, but any foreign material could get into this these byproducts and contaminate it. So you have to take care for that. If the human food processes byproduct for use as animal food, the facility must process the byproduct in compliance with CGMPs. Okay, so they have to use current good manufacturing practices, but they do not have to have a preventive control plan. The facility needs to determine whether there are any hazards that require preventive control. If the facility determines that they have hazards, then they have to have a preventive control plan. If they determine that there are no hazards, they need to document that determination in its hazard analysis, but they wouldn't have to establish preventive control. The main thing is document your process. Document how you concluded that there is not a hazard that needs a preventive control. That's something very, very important. And you see I've footnoted here, guidance for industry 239 goes into some great detail on this point. While I have this little footnote up here, these FDA guidances are sort of directing documents that they use to implement their regulations. So guidance for industry is very important to understand and to be made aware of. Okay, so what's a hazard analysis? First, you have to identify the hazard. It can be anything that's known or reasonably foreseeable, either from pathogens, from chemicals, or physical hazards. And as we just said, they could be present because they occur naturally, or maybe they're unintentionally introduced. Or, and this is the really bad case, they're intentionally introduced for economic gain. If they're adulterated in some manner for economic gain that compromises the food safety of the product. This isn't a specific application for adulteration, but it is the example I'm about to give is something that could be unintentionally introduced. If you do not have the proper procedures, standard operating procedures, for example, to clean out your feed bins and your mixing processes, you could have an additive in feed, for example, for a horse that could be deadly if it was present in pig feed. Rumensin in cattle feed is very problematic for other types of animals. So you need to have very, very specific standard operating procedures to prevent hazards. If you have a multi-species feed mill, you need to have standard operating procedures that would prevent this kind of a problem and make sure those are followed. If your hazard analysis reveals you have hazards that require preventive control, you have to implement written preventive controls. Here's the thing. If these plans and steps that you need to take for corrective action or preventive controls are not written, they do not exist. Why? Because if you have a problem and someone comes to inspect your facility and you do not have a written plan and written documentation, you have nothing. It must be written, and it must be available within 24 hours. The best thing to do is to have it on site and to have that documentation there accessible for whatever inspector may be involved. Preventive controls. We've talked a lot about, or mentioned a lot about preventive controls. What are they? Well, they're controls to prevent hazards. They have to be written, they have to be implemented to ensure that any hazard will be significantly minimized or prevented to help ensure that the food's not adulterated. So, for example, if you know that there's a particular issue with an additive, let's say that's from an animal source, and you need to take care to control temperature or to control access so other animals or vermin can't get into contaminated, that needs to be in your preventive control plan. So preventive controls need to significantly minimize or prevent any hazards that might occur that you have identified. So there are three types of preventive controls. First is a process control. This ensures control of parameters during processing operations, cooking, refrigeration, acidifying, and they must include parameters and values. These parameters are called critical limits. Critical limits are in your process controls. If you need to heat the animal protein up to 140 degrees to eliminate certain pathogens, that's a critical limit, and it needs to be in your process controls. So process controls are very, very important, particularly if you're manufacturing food with protein additives or if you're manufacturing any kind of wet food or food that would be fed to dogs and cats. So process controls are key. We'll get into more about that later. Sanitation controls. This is what I call your standard sanitation operating procedure. How clean do you keep your facility? What is your wash down process? What is your cleaning of the mixing vats, et cetera, when you're changing from one species to the other? We want environmental pathogens and hazards from employees handling animal food to be limited. So you must have sanitation controls. And then there are other controls, and that's sort of the catch-all, but those are necessary to ensure that a hazard requiring a preventive control will be minimized or prevented. There could be things like, for example, like I mentioned earlier, glass, plastic, other things that could fall into your feed bins or vats. You need to have controls to minimize or prevent those kind of contaminations. Okay, so you have certain requirements that have to be in your written food safety plan. And one of the requirements is you have to have a system for oversight and management of your preventive controls. You can have these wonderful preventive controls, but if you don't have a system to manage them, they're just so much paper. So once you've identified this stuff, you have to have a monitoring procedure. So that's the first step in oversight and management of your preventive control program is your monitoring. And these are designed to give you assurance that your controls are performed. You got to keep records. Monitoring is conducted as appropriate to the preventive control. So for example, I go back to heat again. Check your thermometers periodically to make sure they're operating and your product is being processed at the correct temperatures to remove the pathogens. And you have to document your monitoring. There are monitoring forms that you can structure. Someone in the plant needs to be identified to record this information, and then what's called a preventive control qualified individual must sign off on this. And so let me talk just a minute about that. Everyone that works in your animal food process must be a qualified individual. What does that mean? It simply means they must be trained in what they're doing. If you have to bring somebody in from another part of your operation, you must train them before you put them in the feed mill or the place that's manufacturing your animal food. So what is a preventive control qualified individual? That's someone that's gone through the preventive control education for animal food. They will have completed Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance course or sanctioned course for animal food. Just like what we're going through today is a skeleton of the first session. And there are 10 sessions. It's a 2.5-day process, and these are offered periodically around the country in different locations. Some of them are done by feed grain associations. Some of them are done by universities. So if you decide that your operation is in need of this type of education, certainly we can direct you to places where you can find out where training is being given and where you may attend. But you have to have a process control, a preventive control qualified individual in your plant to sign off on everything that's being monitored and validated. If you don't, woe unto you if you get inspected, because it will not be a pleasant activity for you. Here's a second thing that deals with oversight and management of preventive controls. Corrections. These are things that you can do to correct the problem. Identify and correct a minor problem, an isolated problem that occurs during food production. This should not be a systematic problem because you should have designed preventive controls and standard operating procedures to prevent most of your problems. So these are things that occur periodically that you deal with in a timely manner. Here are some things that that might happen. And you anticipate these and try to have corrective actions for them. Corrective actions could include anything to identify and correct a problem implementing a preventive control. So you've got a problem having something implemented, and that would take a corrective action in training to reduce likelihood the problem will occur, to evaluate affected animal food for safety. You may have spot laboratory checks and have some preventive corrective action there for your preventive control. May require some reprocessing or something. Or to prevent food from entering commerce if you can't assure that the affected food is not adulterated. If you cannot correct the problem with certainty, then it has to be disposed of. It cannot enter commerce. It must be disposed of. And there again, in italics there at the bottom, you must document your corrective actions. And look, the hope is that we would all identify any corrective action that we had to take before someone else found it. That's what we would hope, that our procedures and our validations and our preventive controls that we design and our operating procedures we design and our animal food safety plan that we design allows us to catch anything that doesn't meet our critical limit. But if it doesn't, we better hope that we have documented our corrective action. And here's the third thing, verification. This is spot checking in a planned fashion, statistical fashion, whether your preventive control is operating like you intended it to. And that establishes that it's valid. You know, these things need to be scientifically validated to ensure that your control measure can control the hazard that you've identified. And so that you calibrate and check the accuracy of process monitoring and verification instruments like thermometers, like timers. If you have a cooking process, you know, what's going on there with the control there for your thermostat to control your temperature. Other activities include reviewing records. I mean, this is a big one. A lot of people have problems verifying because their records are messed up. Record review is a big deal, and you have to make sure that your monitoring and corrective actions are being conducted properly. So that's a part of the verification. And you have to document that it's been verified. So have a process in place to verify all your preventive controls, and then document when the verification is done and by whom it's done. So that will keep you even with the board. You can read this note here, but I want to talk a little bit about recall plans. Every facility that produces animal food that has a hazard with a preventive control must have a recall plan. You must have a recall plan. Many facilities conduct what they call mock recalls. They will pretend that they have a certain issue and they'll run a mock recall, kind of a dry run, a dress rehearsal for a recall. There is no requirement in FSMA that you conduct a mock recall, but you must have a recall plan. You must be prepared if something goes wrong, how you're going to recall the product out of commerce. but you do not have to conduct a mock recall. Now, we mentioned a while ago about supply chain programs to address ingredient hazards. And there are two instances that would require that you implement a risk-based supply chain program. If the hazard that you identify requires a preventive control and the control will be applied in the facility's supply chain, you must have a supply chain program. So, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that manufacturers, it means that manufacturers don't need to have a supply chain program if they control a hazard in their own facility. In other words, if it's in your own facility, it's not in the supply chain, it's under your control. The other instance where you don't have to have a program is if the customer is a facility that will control the hazard. So if they will provide documentation that they have controlled the hazard when it left their plant, then that would not require a supply chain program, because it would have been documented that it's prevented in the facility that is supplying your ingredient. Now, here's the deal, though. Anybody manufacturing animal food has to ensure that all the raw materials and ingredients that require a supply chain control are received only from approved suppliers. In other words, if you are getting an ingredient, raw material from a supplier that is not approved, then their supply chain control program is not valid. So make certain that you're only receiving from approved suppliers that have an approved supply chain plan or an approved preventive control for animal food, animal food safety plan for their manufacturing. Now, you can receive things on a temporary basis from somebody that's unapproved, so long as you verify their raw materials before you accept them for use. This could happen. I mean, things happen. Maybe there's a problem with your regular supplier and you've got to take input from somewhere else. You better verify that that raw material meets your requirements, or just don't use it. So there are allowances for that. And what about brokers and distributors? They can conduct verification activities, but whoever's receiving the product has to review and assess the documentation. In other words, if you have a third-party audit by some other group, even if they're approved for third-party audit, you need to review and assess the documentation for the supplier verification activities. While I'm talking about third-party audits, there's nothing in FSMA that mandates or requires third-party audits. That is not required in FSMA. Now, before we get into this business of farm descriptions and definitions, let me just say a couple of let me make a couple of seemingly random observations. One is that this approval in your food safety plan for animal food is approved on a facility by facility basis. If you have multiple facilities, you have to have multiple approvals. So you can't just say, well, we got one for this facility and we own these other ones, so they're approved. That's not the case. One other thing I want to mention, if perhaps you're in a cooperative, the manager of the facility, not the person in charge of food facility registration, is the one that must be the preventive control qualified individual. It may seem a little counterintuitive that the manager of the co-op would not be the one in charge, but it's actually the manager of that facility and not the person in charge of the food. If you happen to be blending food for animals that has some proprietary additive, whether it be an amino acid mix, some proprietary organic or herbal treatment, something that gives you a competitive advantage over others in the market, when you list your ingredients, you must, or you don't have to, but you should omit anything that does not pertain to your food safety plan, and anything that may pertain to your food safety plan that is a competitive advantage, mark that material business confidential. This is to protect your competitive advantage. So that may be kind of a fine point, but many of you may develop processes or ingredients that are not broadly used in the industry. And it would be important for you to protect that and not share that information. Here's something else. You may want to keep records on maintenance of your grounds. What is your plan to keep rubbish and trash picked up? You need to have a system. If an inspector comes up to your facility and it looks pristine and everything is documented, you're far less likely to have a problem than if an inspector comes up and there's trash laying around and there's water standing everywhere, and you don't have your records documented. It just makes sense. If you're going to sell a house, you want to prep the house for sale. It's the same way you're selling the quality of your manufacturing facility. So it needs to look good. It needs to function properly. You need to have plans and you need to have documentation. This is something else that an inspector told me. I asked him, I said, what if you're retrofitting a plant, or you're revising a plant, or even building a new one? What is something that is a common problem? Here's what they told me. The common problem is not allowing enough space around the equipment for cleaning by air, dry clean, or wet clean. Leave space so that you can clean around your equipment. Now, don't try to pack everything. You know, your floor space is the cheapest thing you've got in a feed mill. So don't try to cram everything in together so that it can't be properly cleaned and dry, because that's a red flag for your inspectors. Okay. Now let's talk about farms. Note this first statement. Operations meeting the definition of a farm are not subject to preventive controls for animal food rule. That means that you can do whatever you get ready to do, right? No, it does not. We still want to be good stewards and manage our feed manufacturing and animal food production system responsibly, but it just means that you don't have to meet these preventive control rules. So let's find out what what a farm is. There you see it's an operation under one management, but not necessarily contiguous. A location devoted to growing of crops, harvesting crops, raising of animals, or any combination of these activities. Pretty much what you'd think is a farm. If it's growing crops or animals and harvesting crops and animals, and it's all under one management, it's a farm. If you lease property but don't own it and it's scattered about, over across 10 miles, you have 1,000 acres. It's in 5 different chunks. It's scattered over a portion of a county, and it's under one management. It's a production farm, a primary production farm. It allows farms to pack or hold raw commodities that are grown on a farm under a different management. So in other words, if you lease part of your farm out to someone else and they grow food and pack or hold ag commodities under a different management, it's still a farm. Companies that solely harvest crops from farmers are included within farm definition. If there's a company that does custom combining of grains, that's included under the farm. An operation devoted to raising animals is not subject to preventive controls for animal food rule. Keep that in your mind. If you're devoted to raising animals, you are not subject to preventive controls for animal food rule. And a feed mill that supplies animal food may be a part of a farm or may be subject to the regulation. So you could have a feed mill where you make your own food for your animals. That would be part of a farm. But if you have a feed mill that sells food to other ranchers or farmers, then you're subject to regulation. So just because you're on the farm doesn't mean you're freed from the regulation of preventive controls. Now they have this thing called a secondary activities farm. And I'll let you read that. It's very limited application to animal food beyond harvesting, packing, and holding of grain. So you could read that, but I'm suspecting that most of the people on this webinar or that will be working with folks in the animal food realm will be on primary production farms, or they will have standalone mills or feeding operations that handle animals from several farms, in which case they'd be under regulation. This secondary activities thing is sort of a little nuance that may be employed under certain circumstances. Now here's one for you, vertically integrated operations. I have heard it said that vertically integrated operations are horrible. The poultry industry and the swine industry come under fire all the time for being vertically integrated. No one has any power. The growers are in these contracts of adhesion, and there are all these problems. Well, the truth of the matter is, if done properly, a vertically integrated farming operation is one of the safest things you can have, and it's obviously recognized because they're not subject to preventive controls for animal food final rule. So you can see there on this slide in smaller print, I've got 2 comments that, and most of this information was taken from various FDA documents. But my 2 comments are that FDA remains concerned that not having these feed mills subject to preventive controls for animal food leaves a gap in the protection of human and animal health because these feed mills manufacture significant amounts of animal food. my response to that would be this: it does not benefit a vertically integrated firm to manufacture food that they are not paying particular attention to, because they're feeding it to their animals and they're processing those animals to sell meat or animal products. And there's very little benefit for them to be sloppy or lazy in their treatment of animal food. The second point, FDA intends to publish a proposed rule in the future that will require some feed mill operations that are currently part of a farm to implement CGMPs established by Preventive Control for animal food. Remember, CGMP, current good manufacturing practices, those have been established for many, many years. So what this is saying is earlier in the presentation, I talked about the fact that if you're producing feed on your farm and you're feeding it to your animals, you're not subject to preventive controls. All this says is that they want to have a guidance that would say you were subject to current good manufacturing practices. So again, I want to go over these dates of compliance. Find yourself on here. I suspect most of the people that we'll be working with are very small businesses, unless they happen to be tribally owned and the tribe itself does not have that as a separate business entity. And the fact that it might be very small in terms of sales, but if it has more than 500 full-time equivalent employees, it will be considered a small business. If it has over 500, it's considered a larger business, being the first category. So the structure matters, and it's going to determine when you must be in compliance with these current good manufacturing practices and the preventive controls. I have these slides at the end. There's some guidances that are in process. You can access these on the web. Draft guidance on current good manufacturing practice requirements, draft guidance on human food byproducts for use as animal food. This is the orange peelings and the potato peelings and the different parts of processing waste, perhaps, that wouldn't be used for human food. Small entity compliance guide that explains how a small entity must comply with a rule. There's a draft guidance. I believe that's a double reference there to the second one on the previous slide. And then it also gives the FSMA Technical Assistance Network. So this ends the presentation. I covered a lot of ground. Remember, this is a 2.5-day intensive face-to-face train the trainer process. But what I wanted to do is give you an idea about what the preventive controls for animal food look like, and give you a heads up on what you may need to be preparing for based on what kind of a producer you are at the moment. So, Brian, at that, I'll turn it to you for any questions that may have come in.
All right, thank you, HL. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you would like to ask a question, go to the questions box that's in your control panel, and you can type in a question there, and I will read it out loud, and HL will give you the answer to the best of his abilities and knowledge. I will also remind everyone that you can go to our website here at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety, the website that you see on your screen there, and you'll see a cornucopia of resources there, including a listing of all the webinars that we have done in the past, and there will be videos of those webinars. Materials that we reference in the webinars, you'll find links to those materials there. And then you'll just find a lot of other food safety information. And so when you go to that the website that you see, the link that you see on the screen, that'll take you to our main food safety page. And then if you look on the left side of the page, you'll see links to webinars, our in-person trainings, our resource library, and that kind of thing. So now would be a good time to submit your question. I don't see, I see one question coming in. The question is there a source for a food safety manual for animal food similar to what was distributed in the produce safety in-person training?
The answer to that is yes, and it would be available when you attend an animal food training similar to the produce safety rule training. I've got one, and it's about the same thickness as the one from the produce safety rule.
Okay, so you're saying it's just a little light reading?
Yes, yes. Yeah, if you got 15 minutes, before Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow, you might want, or on Thursday, you may want to open it up, and I don't even know how many pages it is. It's huge. It's probably 1.5 inches thick.
Mm.
But yes, it's available, and it's very detailed.
All right. Thank you for the question. I am not seeing any other questions coming in. I will remind everyone before we close out today's webinar that we do have 2 more webinars that are going to close out the 2017 schedule that we're doing. And those, we've recently rescheduled those. We're going to have legal issues, parts 1 and 2. Part 1 is going to be on December 18th at 4 p.m. and part 2 will be on December 20th at 4 p.m. And if you go to the website that you see on your screen there and go to the webinar series link, you'll see a place where you can register for those last 2 webinars. And then here in the next few weeks, I am going to post all of the webinars that we currently have scheduled for 2018, and those are going to begin in January. So please visit our website, check out our resources, register for our remaining webinars, and thank you everyone for attending. HL, did you have any final thoughts?
No, many of you will be traveling, perhaps for holidays or getting with family. So I encourage you to make the most of that. And I'm thankful for this opportunity to share about food safety and help us move the ball down the field for Native American producers of food and food products. So thank you, Brian, for helping to organize this.
That's a great thought to end on. Everyone have a great Thanksgiving holiday, and we'll see you next time.